Welcome back to the History Channel at Fort Stewart, Georgia, home of the 3rd Infantry Division. I'm Arthur Kent. Thousands of soldiers from here are currently stationed in Kuwait at a U.S. staging point so massive it covers more than 1,600 square miles. In 1991, in Operation Desert Storm, U.S. troops like these were prepared for fierce ground resistance from the Iraqi army. But in fact, they were in for a big surprise. No one expected the scenario they would encounter. Join us now for Operation Desert Storm, the Ground War.
Three, two, one.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
Oh, we got it! Oh, that blew the hell out of it!
From the first day of Operation Desert Storm, the air campaign was a resounding success. But the American commanders knew that a ground war against the Iraqis would be a far greater challenge.
When we looked at what we were facing, we were significantly outnumbered.
When planning began in September 1990, General Norman Schwarzkopf believed that as many as 545,000 Iraqi troops were occupying Kuwait. He had only 200,000 Allied troops headed to the Persian Gulf region, enough to protect Saudi Arabia, but that was about all.
We had a difficult time with ground operations in that we had limited number of ground forces. As a result, our initial attacks were directly into the face of the enemy in Kuwait. Well, that really didn't make much sense.
Schwarzkopf and his generals, who had fought as junior officers in Vietnam, wanted a different kind of war, one with enough troops and firepower to ensure a quick and decisive victory with minimum casualties.
The war in Vietnam was a presence, I guess I would say, at many of the discussions and the debates. They wanted to make certain that this time around that we didn't have the same kind of mistakes, frankly, that were made in Southeast Asia.
Schwarzkopf asked the Bush administration for more forces to mount a successful ground assault. He got 3 more aircraft carriers, reserve troops, and most importantly, the heavily armored 7th Corps, then stationed in Germany.
We had the complete support of the President of the United States and Secretary of Defense. Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney made sure that we had whatever forces we needed. So when it came time to request the 7th Corps, there was never a doubt. It was done.
While the 7th Corps was on its way from Germany, Schwarzkopf and his planners began laying out their strategy to mount their primary attack from a direction Saddam Hussein would not expect.
He planned to launch the Marines on the first day of the war and play into the Iraqi assumption that the Marines were the main attack, to draw down the Republican Guard. And the second day of the war, he would launch this massive armored force, Army armored force, through the western desert to come in behind the Iraqis and cut them off.
Schwarzkopf called it a left hook. The 2 armored Army corps would move in from the left across the desert. The Marines' role would be crucial to the operation's success.
We were in support of the Army attack in that we were going certainly to hold those Iraqi forces in Kuwait in place. Well, I knew we were going to do a lot more than hold them in place. They were either going to surrender or be killed, and we were going to liberate Kuwait.
In order for his left hook to work, Schwarzkopf had to move 2 Army corps, 2 Marine divisions, and several Allied brigades hundreds of miles across the desert. And he had to do it in secret. Working in Schwarzkopf's favor was Saddam Hussein's assumption that the Americans would never leave the roadways and forge their own path across the unmarked desert terrain.
Remember, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the deserts of Iraq are trackless deserts. Even the maps look like wallpaper. There's no distinctive with the occasional road, and that's it.
You could travel for an hour and look around and think you were in the same spot. One spot looked the same as the other.
But the American military had a new tool, the Global Positioning System, or GPS, to help them navigate the desert. Drivers and ground troops had small handheld devices that could communicate with a system of satellites. Within seconds, the devices could give them their exact coordinates.
I can tell you, if it were not for GPS, I personally would probably still be wandering around the desert in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait. GPS allowed us to fight a division by not using boundaries as we knew them before, not using physical boundaries, geographical boundaries. We could use north-south grid lines.
While we in the military had not gotten used to using the global positioning system, it turned out to be a revolutionary element in the war.
GPS helped the Americans and their allies pull off their massive maneuver across the desert. But as they massed their troops, the Americans had no idea that Saddam Hussein wanted to push his own schedule for the ground war by attacking at a town called Khafji. The battle for Khafji would be a major turning point in the ground war, although few knew it at the time. In late January, a month before the ground war would officially begin, American reconnaissance planes spotted Iraqi tanks massing on the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Saddam Hussein thought he could outfox the Americans by deploying his tanks at night.
Saddam Hussein knew when the American satellites were going over the battle theater. And the Iraqis timed their movements in between the passes of the satellites. When the satellites were overhead, they would stop dead, so they wouldn't be spotted moving. And as soon as the satellite passed over, then they would move again.
But his strategy was spoiled by a new experimental plane called Joint Stars.
This is a unique aircraft. There was only 2 of them. They were prototypes. They weren't even production models. And what they do, they have a radar that can look deep into enemy territory, and they see movement. And an enemy that's going to attack you has to form up in large convoys of hundreds of tanks and trucks and armored personnel carriers. These came at us, but the Joint Stars saw them. They can't hide from Joint Stars.
Joint Stars was a converted Boeing 707 refitted with sophisticated radar and sensors. It gave commanders what they called a God's eye view of the battlefield.
We sent a B-52 strike in there, and then we sent A-10s in there with infrared missiles. And it was like we'd stirred up a hornet's nest or an ant's nest. These vehicles were scattering all over the place. We knew that many vehicles that close to the border spelled trouble.
Despite the massive Air Force response, some of the tanks had already slipped through.
It was a pitch dark night. They came roaring across the border, so to speak, and across into Saudi Arabia.
Saddam's attack came on the evening of January 29th.
How far are they away from Khafji, huh? Getting real close. I mean, hell, if we can come up on a COF, man, I can shoot these bastards. There you go, right there.
He launched a major corps-size attack with 2 mechanized infantry divisions and an armored division to attack into Saudi Arabia, to preempt any American attack, to get the Americans moving to counterattack, and of course they'd be counterattacking on his terms, not their own terms.
The Iraqis attacked at the coastal town of Khafji and at several border posts, including one 50 miles west near Hajul. There, the Iraqis ran into the Marines.
They came down in considerable force and ran into a reconnaissance screen that we had put in front of the Marine forces. This reconnaissance screen was made up of light armored vehicles. These vehicles aren't designed to take on tanks, and we had taught the Marines not to do that, but Marines being Marines, once the battle began, they did take them on.
The light armored vehicles, or LAVs, were the Marines' advanced assault vehicle. They could range up to 410 miles from base and cross the desert at speeds of up to 62 miles an hour.
The LAV being the real quick, lightly armored vehicle that the Marine Corps uses to hit fast, get out fast.
The LAVs were armed with 25-millimeter chain guns or double-barreled tow missile launchers. As the LAVs battled the Iraqis' T-55 tanks on the ground, Cobra helicopters attacked from the air. The Cobras were first designed as the Army's primary attack copter in Vietnam. They were two-man, twin-engine, close support, and attack helicopters that could cross the battlefield at 207 miles an hour. The Marines had fitted the Cobras with air-to-ground missiles, TOWs, and Hellfires so they could take on enemy tanks.
The Cobra helicopter is designed to do one thing and one thing only, and that's destroy enemy targets.
Through night vision goggles, Captain Randy Hammond could see 4 Iraqi tanks threatening the Marines' operation post at Hojul.
Then I put a tow missile into the tank, but we destroyed that tank, and then the rest of the flight came in and we engaged the other 3 tanks.
The Marines stopped the Iraqi attack cold at Hojul. But 50 miles to the east, the Iraqis had taken control of the Saudi resort town of Khafji. The Allies, caught off guard, now had to scramble to take it back.
Tell them they can write off Khafji.
When the Iraqis invaded Khafji on January 29th, they found a deserted town. The Allies had evacuated civilians from Khafji in mid-January when the air war began. Only a token guard remained.
The Saudi Arabian National Guard was there occupying just short of that city. We had Marine reconnaissance forces and forward air controllers and forward observers for artillery there in that small town.
The Americans had not expected Saddam to attack Khafji since it was not a strategic target.
It sort of caught us a little bit by surprise. We weren't defending the town.
When the Iraqis entered the city of Khafji, that was a problem, particularly the Saudi government, because Saudi territory had been invaded. And the king had told Khalid bin Sultan, not 1 inch of Saudi soil.
Of course, once they came down and occupied Saudi soil, it became very important. And the Saudis weren't going to stand for that.
2 Marine reconnaissance units, 12 men in all, were in Khafji when the Iraqis invaded. The Marines hid in strategic positions in town.
They had split up. They were in 2 different locations.
Show the room's clear.
They immediately moved to the rooftops of 2 of the buildings there. And they were in an ideal position because at that particular point, they could observe the Iraqis. They knew what their disposition were. They knew what the types of forces were.
But the reconnaissance teams wouldn't be safe for long. Their commanding officer went to the Saudi commander for help.
And I explained to him the situation. I said, everyone else has left the town. Everyone, all the other forces have departed, but I have 2 Marine recon teams in there. Their safety and their security can probably be guaranteed for maybe 24, 30, but not much longer than that. He said probably what I consider the 2 most important words of the entire war, because he said, we attack.
Because Khafji was in the sector defended by Arab troops, and because the Marines did not have any armored units nearby, the Arab forces would take the lead. But there were concerns.
The Saudis had never actually fought a major engagement against another force. The Qataris, to the best of my knowledge, had never even deployed from their homeland to participate in a major exercise, much less combat. But they had the tanks, they had the armored personnel carrier that we needed, and we would provide the anti-armor systems. More importantly, we provide the artillery and the air support.
After 2 small feints, the Arab forces launched a major attack on Khafji on the morning of January 31st. They fought for 6 hours before driving the Iraqis out of Saudi Arabia. Because American air power had destroyed so many of their tanks before they reached Khafji, the Iraqis could hold the town for only 36 hours.
That attack was never successful because it was destroyed in Kuwait. It was destroyed by air power. As a result, the few tanks that did get into Khafji were repulsed by a Saudi brigade and a Qatari tank company and 2 companies of Saudi National Guard forces.
But the Americans did suffer losses at Khafji, their first casualties on the ground. 11 Marines were killed, all of them by friendly fire. In the heat of battle, 1 light armored vehicle fired a tow missile at another LAV. And a Maverick missile shot from an A-10 malfunctioned and hit an American LAV. 2 weeks later, an Army pilot in an Apache helicopter mistook his coordinates. He saw two vehicles in what he believed was enemy territory.
I hope it's enemy.
That's all right, just stay on.
Here it comes.
That's one.
I guess you could say that hit it.
All right, let's pick up the second one. Let's go. This Bud's for you.
It turned out they were American Bradley fighting vehicles.
Reporting that maybe friendly vehicles may have been hit over. Roger, I was afraid of that. I was really afraid of that.
Ceasefire, ceasefire.
Ceasefire.
None of us have killed anybody before. And when they were Iraqis, that was okay. But 5 seconds after the second vehicle blew up and the call came in, friendly vehicles are hit, it was horror.
Two Americans, Corporal Jeffrey Middleton and Private Robert Talley, were killed. In all, 35 men died from friendly fire in the Gulf War, accounting for 25% of the American deaths. 15% of the wounded were hit by friendly fire. Friendly fire, or fratricide, was not a new problem, but it became a big problem in the Gulf War because the number of people killed by enemy fire was so low. The confusion of the desert, the varied alliance of forces, and the nighttime fighting all increased the risk of fratricide. In addition, some of the new weapons used in the Gulf may have contributed to the mistakes. Many pilots used heat-seeking missiles or thermal imaging, which focused on objects giving off heat.
The heat source of an enemy tank may look very much like the heat source of a friendly tank or a light armored vehicle or BTR-60 from the air.
Other pilots and gunners used night vision goggles, but in the ghostly green light of the goggles, it was difficult to tell friend from foe.
We could fight well at night where our adversaries often cannot. It's the perfect opportunity to use darkness to help you. But that darkness can also lead to more confusion about where you are and identifying targets.
And there was little room for error.
The battlefield is a very, very confused place. It is just, no matter how well you prepare, how well you train, it's chaos. And so in the middle of this chaos, you introduce a weapon that doesn't miss.
Modern weapons have become so lethal that every incident of friendly fire is a highly lethal incident.
After the Battle of Khafji, the Allies began to reassess the Iraqi force they were up against.
Khafji told us a lot about the Iraqis because we watched the attack unfold. It told us that they didn't shoot, move, and communicate very well, and you need to be able to do all three of those things together. And we watched them struggle with that.
In public, General Schwarzkopf downplayed the battle's significance.
In my judgment, from a military standpoint, it's absolutely meaningless. It's really, it's no more than the irritation of a small mosquito as far as this entire campaign is concerned.
But Khafji was important.
The significance of Khafji for Saddam was, in the planning, it was his effort to change the course of the war, to break down our strategy and implement his strategy. Of course, when it failed, it sealed his doom. It showed that they could not defeat us on the ground, that we would not waver from our strategy of destroying his army from the air before we began ground operations. And it showed that he needed to figure out another strategy, which he never did.
Using this hard-won knowledge about the enemy, the Marines began their final preparations for the liberation of Kuwait.
We're going to do it. We're going to do it right. We're going to achieve victory.
After the Battle of Khafji, the Marines began to rethink their initial plan for an amphibious attack along the Kuwaiti coast, an attack the Iraqis were expecting.
They had deployed their occupation army so that it was facing the Gulf because they had assumed that the American Marines were going to land over the beaches the way they do in John Wayne movies.
But General Schwarzkopf thought the amphibious operation would be too dangerous and take too long to prepare. On February 2nd, 2 days after the Battle of Khafji, he met with his commanders.
Schwarzkopf looked at me at that point in time and said, Walt, can you accomplish your mission without the amphibious assault? And it was a long moment, but I said, yes, I can, if we cause them to continue to believe that we are going to conduct the amphibious assault, because they've got a couple of divisions here along the shore that if they are able to free them and turn them against our flank as we attack into Kuwait, then I've got a big problem.
So as a deceptive maneuver, the Marines staged practice landings along the coast.
And the Iraqis bought it. They bought it wholeheartedly. They posted 6 divisions along the coastline and dug in more thoroughly along the coast than they did along the Saudi-Kuwait border.
As they stepped up their preparations to invade Kuwait from Saudi Arabia, the Marines had serious concerns that the Iraqis might use chemical weapons.
Saddam Hussein had used gas against the Iranians in a very devastating, killer-like way.
And the Marines knew they would face Iraqi artillery. The Iraqis used Soviet and South African guns that had a greater range than Marine artillery.
The artillery was what scared us, the Marines, in the 1st Marine Division. We knew we were outnumbered, unbelievably outnumbered as far as artillery.
To reduce the threat from the Iraqi artillery, the Marines used what they called a combined fire system that employed ground radar and air support.
We wanted actually to get into the mind of the artilleryman that when he got on that gun, he was susceptible to being attacked by artillery and by air. So we did a sophisticated system of raids using radars.
The Marines were also concerned about crossing the minefield Saddam Hussein had erected along the Kuwait-Saudi border, called the Saddam Wall.
The Marine Corps had what looked on paper like the most difficult and deadly assignment.
We were told that 1 in 4 would be killed or wounded crossing the minefield and the line of death, as it was called.
To better understand this threat, the Marines secretly sent several scouting units into Kuwait.
Before everyone knew of G-Day, our Marine reconnaissance force went in, small teams of 6 or 7 men, and actually got into the minefields and assessed what was in those minefields.
As the day for the ground war drew closer, more than 3,000 Marines infiltrated across the Iraqi lines.
We literally did it on our hands and knees. Young Marines did it with bayonets in their hands, sticking the blade into the sand, and if it chinked on metal, you knew it was a mine, and you kind of stepped to the right or the left, and you just kept crawling.
The information they provided about the location of the mines would prove invaluable to the rest of the Marines as they prepared for G-Day, now just hours away.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, 40,000 troops in all, began the assault into southern Kuwait. Their left flank was protected by the Army's Tiger Brigade, which was the 1st Brigade, 2nd Armored Division. On the Marines' right flank were the combined Allied Arab forces from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar. The units began their invasion at dawn on February 24th.
G-Day was a dark and gloomy morning as it started to get light. The smoke from the oil fires was very heavy.
Hussein had ordered all of the Kuwaiti oil fields blown up. These are extremely high pressure wells, so you have this huge, huge fire burning with dark black smoke. You could walk into the smoke and think you were in the dead of night, but yet it was still the middle of the day.
Luckily for the Marines, the wind was blowing the smoke away from them that morning. To breach the Saddam Wall, the Marines used special equipment, the most important piece, a plow attached to the front of their M60 tanks.
You take a regular tank and you put a big, huge plow in front of it with huge metal teeth this big so that the mine really won't destroy it, and it plows through the sand and plows these things and pushes them aside, literally plows a furrow through the minefield.
They also used line charges, rocket-propelled cords shot from the back of a tank. Attached to the cord were hundreds of small plastic explosives, which the Marines could detonate to explode the mines. One line charge could clear a 330-foot path through a minefield. With the special equipment and the intelligence they received from their early reconnaissance teams, the Marines were able to breach the first set of minefields.
It was done very quickly because we hit at the points where they were the weakest.
But getting through the first minefield was only the beginning.
We knew that once we penetrated that first barrier, that the momentum of the attack absolutely had to remain as intense as we could make it and move as fast as we could to move up to the second barrier and then penetrate the second barrier. We could not allow ourselves, in other words, to pause, because the Iraqi counterattack could have been devastating if we were caught between two major barriers of that type.
As the Marines advanced, they had close air support from their own aviation units. The AV-8B Harriers, called jump jets because they could take off and land vertically. Each carried a 25mm cannon and a 4-ton bomb load. They flew with FA-18 Hornet fighter bombers, single-seat carrier-based jets. The Hornet was the Marines' premier attack aircraft. Both jets worked closely with ground forces.
We used counterfire in a very unique way on that battlefield. Not only did we do counterfire with artillery against artillery, we used counterfire with our F-18s and our Harriers. We had a forward air controller with the artillery radars, which could give 10-digit grid points of where the enemy artillery was shooting from. That forward air controller would pass that information to the F-18s, who would immediately put it into their guidance system and attack the Iraqi artillery.
With that kind of firepower, the Marines were able to breach both minefields the first day of fighting. But their fiercest opposition was still to come. The biggest challenge for the Marines on the first day of the ground war was the overwhelming number of Iraqis who were surrendering.
We'd made some preparation. We'd actually stockpiled food. We had indicated places for POW compounds, sort of the normal kind of thing that you would do. But we didn't expect them to surrender in such huge numbers.
Thousands surrendered the first day, posing a logistical problem for the Marines.
Enemy prisoners of war have a tendency to really hold you down, to cause you to collect them, to process them, to get them back to safety, to get them out of the battle, and so on. And it takes a lot of time to do that.
But more dangerous were the smaller groups of Iraqis who continued to fight.
My estimate has been that probably 75% of them surrendered, 25% decided to fight.
Telling the two groups apart was not always easy.
If you put yourself in the shoes of the young Marine who has been taught that these that are surrendering, he's not supposed to kill them. But at the same time, he's got over here people shooting at him and he's got to deal with.
Get him out of here! Let's go!
And it was very difficult to ascertain which was surrendering and which wasn't. Oftentimes, as they were apparently engaged in discussions on what they should do, and they would hear us, they would all start running to the trench lines, and then we'd begin to receive fire as a result of it.
Despite those delays, the Marines advanced an astonishing 30 miles the first day. They camped at the Al-Burqan oil field that night.
When the Marines and the Eastern Area Corps moved through those minefields, through those barbed wire, through those fire trenches, past those abandoned artillery sites, then that was a huge relief, because then we knew the rest of the attacks, which would be delayed a little bit, would go much smoother.
Day 2 of the Marine advance was more difficult and dangerous. The smoke from the burning oil fields was now blowing into their faces. In this veil of fog and smoke, the Marines heard reports of a possible Iraqi counterattack.
We had from what I will call a A1 source intelligence that 2 brigades of the 5th Mechanized Corps was preparing to attack from our flank. And they said that the Iraqi prisoner says they are going to come out of the fires. We didn't believe anyone could live in the middle of those fires. 600 raging oil well fires.
The Marines fired artillery rounds from their M198 towed howitzers and the M110 series self-propelled howitzers into the areas where they believed the Iraqis were waiting to attack.
As we did that, it was like rabbits coming out of the briar patch.
You could kind of see the sand coming to life as you saw all these tanks and armored vehicles, in essence from horizon to horizon, coming towards the elements of Task Force Papa Bear.
At the front, the Marines' M60s squared off against Iraqi T-55 and T-72 tanks. The M60s were ancient by American standards, 30-year-old 57-ton battle tanks for 4-man crews, but the Iraqi warheads were no match for the newly re-armored M60s. However, at the 1st Division's forward command post, the Marines had only LAVs to protect them. The LAVs were not designed to fight tanks head-to-head. Usually, they could rely on air support to protect them. But because of the heavy smoke, most fighter jets could not fly into the battle.
The F-18s could not penetrate the smoke, could not get low enough to be able to acquire these targets. So it was not a very friendly environment for fixed-wing aircraft, jet aircraft to be operating in.
So squadrons of Cobra attack helicopters were sent in. The Cobras carried a variety of weapons, primarily the Hellfire missile, a 100-pound laser-guided warhead which could destroy a tank from up to 5 miles away.
The Cobras with the Hellfire missiles were probably the most effective killer of the Iraqi armored forces.
But even the Cobras needed help. Unlike the Army's newer Apache helicopters, most of the Cobras did not have laser designation or thermal imaging capabilities.
We couldn't see the T-72 tanks because of the poor visibility, but the FLIR on the OV-10 had the capability to see through the smoke.
The Marines' OV-10 Bronco was a propeller-driven reconnaissance plane. Its forward-looking infrared or FLIR technology allowed it to see vehicles that were giving off heat. The pilot could then point a laser at the target so the Cobras could aim their Hellfire missiles.
The OV-10 was identifying targets for us. We launched probably 6 Hellfire missiles. I didn't find out until literally years later that each one of those missiles actually found a target.
The Cobras kept firing, trying to protect the LAVs near the 1st Division's command post.
As these armored vehicles and tanks again came charging out of the fog towards our friendly troops, we got the cleared hot call from the folks on the ground to go out there and do what we needed to do to engage these targets, and again we went out there with our Hellfire missiles, which will take a tank down to the treads in about 2 seconds.
The Iraqis came close to destroying the Marine command post and causing heavy losses, but the Marines were able to beat them back.
Using mortars and artillery and anti-tank weapons, we were able to defeat that counterattack, but it was a huge counterattack across the flank of the 1st Marine Division. And I think the largest tank battle the Marine Corps has been in history was fought by the 1st Marine Regiment.
As the 2nd day of the ground war ended, the Marines were primed to complete their mission: liberate Kuwait. By late on February 26th, the 3rd day of the ground war, the Marines were in position to retake Kuwait City from the Iraqis.
The 1st Marine Division had taken Kuwait International Airport. 2nd Marine Division was just really poised sort of below Kuwait City to the west.
Although the Marines could have gone into Kuwait City early on the 27th, the decision was made for Arab forces to liberate the city.
The Americans had been very careful to make sure that Arab forces technically went in and captured the city so that it would not look like the Western Allies were overrunning the city, that in fact Arabs were being freed by Arabs. It was a very careful political decision.
When the Arab divisions entered Kuwait City that morning, the Iraqis occupying the city had already fled. Later in the afternoon, Marine General Walter Boomer led a small convoy into Kuwait City.
We were the first Americans into the city with the exception of some reconnaissance Marines that had been in.
Actually, the Marine commander was not the first Westerner in the city. An American television crew was already there. The media had been frustrated at the military's restrictions on access and coverage. No reporters or cameras had been allowed near fighting units without direct approval from the military. The reporters were organized into pools, and they waited for permission to go out with the troops.
The pool system really came from the overwhelming numbers of reporters who wanted to cover the war. For the Normandy invasion, World War II, there were 27. On any given day in Vietnam, there were about 40 reporters out in the field, and a max in Vietnam at any one time, about 300 reporters. We had 1,095 reporters.
It was not just the overwhelming number of reporters that troubled the military. It was also their lack of experience.
One of the major problems I encountered in working with the media is that when a war occurs, everybody shows up. And so you have the reporter who writes obituaries for the Cleveland Daily Press.
I don't think news organizations would send a reporter to the Super Bowl who didn't understand football. But they sent many reporters who had no idea about the military.
The pool system angered the reporters and cameramen.
Everybody was chafing under these pool regulations that no reporter can go anywhere unless he's accompanied by a military officer, and you have to go to the unit that you've been assigned to.
In addition, the military was in no hurry to help reporters in the field get their material into the newspapers or onto the air.
Here you had the high-tech war. High-tech bombs, missiles. I mean, we saw the videotaped evidence of it every day in those briefings by General Schwarzkopf and others. Yet they drove the videotape back from the front 200 miles to Tehran. They didn't fly it, they didn't send it by satellite, they drove it.
So in February, some television networks began making preparations to cover the ground war without the military's help.
We sent David Green and Bob McEwen out, just hoping that we would get some decent pictures of actual combat occurring. We didn't realize that they would lead the assault into Kuwait.
Late on February 26th, the CBS crew arrived in Kuwait City. They called into their bureau in Dhahran.
I remember being in the newsroom and hearing a two-way radio go off. And it was David Green saying, "I'm in Kuwait City." And I thought it was some kind of a mistake.
We have Bob McEwen live up from, we believe, inside Kuwait City. Bob, are you there?
Dan, I'm here, and I think from this day forward, history will record that Independence Day here in Kuwait, certainly here in Kuwait City, will be February the 26th, 1991.
And a crowd of people that just came around us and wanted to tell us their stories. And we went on the air surrounded by these people, reporting to Dan Rather that, in fact, the Iraqis were leaving and that Kuwait was a free city again.
Although the military was not happy that the television crews had broken out of the pool system, there were some benefits.
At one point, when we were on the air in Kuwait City, we went down for several minutes. And I am told that there were calls from the State Department and from the Pentagon to CBS saying, "Could you put those guys back up again, please?" Because they were learning what was happening from us.
The fact that Kuwait City was back in Kuwaiti hands meant that the Marines had completed their mission. After months of planning, the liberation of Kuwait City took less than 4 days. The Marines' swift success took the Central Command by surprise.
We did move faster, I think, than General Schwarzkopf thought that we were going to be able to. I wasn't sure how fast we were going to be able to move, but I knew it was going to be pretty quick. It's a small country.
One reason they were able to move so quickly was because of the meticulous groundwork the Marines laid out before they attacked.
I felt that our plans and our preparation was good enough so that we would move very quickly. We would retake Kuwait very quickly, with casualties perhaps in the hundreds, but we were able to do it in 3 days with hardly any casualties.
Another reason the Marines moved so fast is that there were not as many Iraqis opposing them as intelligence had led them to believe.
They had not 540,000 troops, but more on the order of 200,000 troops, because many of them had gone AWOL in the period leading up to the ground war.
Those who did remain in Kuwait did not fight as effectively as they might have, because they did not coordinate their attacks.
They did use artillery, but they used artillery early and sporadically. But then they would attack with their armored vehicles without using the artillery. Their air defenses had already been taken down, so they were vulnerable with their armor moving across the desert floor to our Cobras. And without the artillery, then our ground systems, the light armored vehicle, the TOWs, and our tanks were very effective.
But most importantly, the Marine success was due to the 5 weeks of constant U.S. bombing.
The air war took its toll on the Iraqi soldier. I mean, it was devastating. And that air campaign made our job a lot easier.
They were a broken, beaten army by the time the first ground troops moved against them. And that was largely because of the tremendous air power America put into the skies.
For the Marines who entered Kuwait City on February 27th, the Persian Gulf War was over. It was an exhilarating triumph.
We were all very battle-weary and very tired, but it just lifted our spirits because the Kuwaiti people were in such jubilation, such celebration. I can remember Kuwaiti families coming up when they could get to us and holding up their babies for us to touch their baby. I can remember them saying, "Thank God, George Bush, thank God, Marines."
As you began to listen what they were saying, I mean, there's literally thousands of people now as we drove along, it was, God bless you, America. Thank you. We love you. So for us, that was a pretty emotional time.
For the Marines, many of whom had trained and waited in the Saudi desert for 6 months, their hard work had paid off. Kuwait City was once again free. Their mission was accomplished. But the war was not over yet. Saddam Hussein had held back the Republican Guard, his elite professional army, from the brunt of the American air campaign. Taking on the Republican Guard would be the job of the Army's heavy armored divisions.
News organizations are demanding greater access to American combat operations. The Pentagon has organized media boot camps where military-style training is offered to journalists. The Pentagon's promise, as of now, is to allow reporters access to the front. Some journalists' organizations have pledged in turn to hold the Pentagon to that promise.